financial planners and attorneys and staff. They got chief, they've got.
Just think of how much
schedule
that they
planners.
pay in all of that too, because of their business.
Staff.
We're live.
Greetings, I'm Dr. Al Freeman, Director of LCMS School Ministry, and we are blessed today to have Mark Cannon, Chief Financial Officer with the Lutheran Foundation here. Thank you for joining us, Mark. This is something that's much requested and much needed for all of our ministries, today in particular our school ministries. Will Van, Manager of School Ministry, is here as well. Always running the boards and checking chat and doing anything and everything that Will does. Amazing work on his part too. So, why don't I open us in prayer? And Mark has a speaker bio slide, so I'd hate to overtake that slide with a lengthy introduction, but we'll get there too. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this wonderful and glorious day and for all of your ministries that do your work. We ask especially you be with our school ministries and all that they do, especially this time of year where so much is going on and weather is crazy in different ways, and spring break is either here or approaching, and we're in the Lenten season and approaching Easter joy. We ask that you continue to be with our educators, our administrators, all the staff that work at our Lutheran schools and do your work. Allow them to be that shining light in your community, and be with us today, especially be with Mark as he presents on a vital topic to school ministries and all ministries, how to be financially stable and strong so that they can go on and do your work for many, many years to come if you so desire. Be with us all as we learn and grow and do all to your glory. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Mark, again, thank you for being here and joining us. I approached Mark a few weeks ago and asked him and said, hey, I've had a lot of questions coming from school people and also non-school people working in ministries around our country, and asked about, hey, how do we start a foundation? Who has a foundation? How can we get some good ideas? What about endowments? So, in my infinite wisdom, I said, let me find the person that knows this.
Yeah.
That's Mark Cannon.
Wow.
And he can help us and guide us and give us some great advice over what we have as a 3-part Zoom series. So this is part 1 of 3.
Amazing. What a blessing. I saw Al here at the International Center where we both work, 4 or 5 weeks ago. So I hope you're forgiving on the slides. There could be a typo because we at the foundation are so excited to have a chance to talk about the 2 things that we do for the church. And one of them is helping congregations and ministries with making endowments. So glad for the talk, glad for the forum. I know you guys meet pretty often on different things. Hopefully this one is a good one. And as Al said, this is such a big topic. He said right away, it's kind of like when you have a Netflix or an Apple TV series. We need 3 episodes here. There's so much to talk about. It's probably true. This is one of these topics that when we talk about it, so many congregations and ministries want to do this, and that it takes a long time to get to it. So what we can do is help you think through the front end. Honestly, the hardest part is getting started. What do you do? Who do you talk to? And what you need are the people like you on this Zoom and on video, the leaders at the school level to take action, take control, have conversations, form committees. And so we'll try to walk you through all that here today in the next few months.
Trying to eliminate the paralysis analysis starting point, right? Because you tend to spin your wheels. So this is great. At some point, you've got to start.
Yeah. And honestly, as you start today, if you want to do this, I'd expect best case is 6 months. Mm-hmm. If you do something in September of 24, you've beaten the odds. If it takes a year, you're probably a little too slow, I'll be honest. But somewhere in there, you got to talk to a lot of people. You've got to do some research. Today it's just a start. And as we talked about, there's 3 parts here. And I was joking about Netflix. I don't know if we'll do a season 2 on this album. We'll see how 2025 goes.
See what the demand is, right?
Exactly. We'll see what
our ratings out there.
And if people are staying on today. But so today we'll talk about concepts, about what each of these vehicles are, and a lot of terminology. You've heard these things, and endowments can have some different usages where someone may use that word, but maybe it's not legally one. So we'll talk through some of that detail in a fair amount, and certainly welcome questions. This is meant to be useful. And again, the whole point is for you to either take action or at least consider it and understand the risks and the steps when you're ready.
So I will say that If you do have a question at any point in time, please type that in chat. Will is looking at the chat all the time, and then we will have some opportunity for the end for some questions. And if you think of one, the next one is 4/4, April 4th. So you can email that to us and we can kind of cover that at the next session too. So if you don't hit it right now, you think, oh, wait, I have one now, what do I do? There's plenty of time.
Yeah, yeah, and they're going to overlap. The first session is concepts, the second session is execution. What do you do to actually start an endowment? And that's a lot to consider in choices. The third session in May, we'd say, is the whole purpose is to grow your endowment or foundation. It's there to set up future giving and future ministry growth. So a lot of the thinking should be, once you have it in place, what are the goals you're trying to achieve?
And I think we have some documents to possibly share as well. So there's going to be resources for you at any time as well.
Definitely. Honestly, a lot of this is about the documents. That's part of what you're going to have to do to get this in place. And that can be a hurdle. And so thinking through it. As Al said, here's the bio. And it's really two things you should know about me. You can tell up there. Number one, I love spreadsheets. I really do. And I think, my talents and my interests are in the areas of finance, economics, and accounting. But God has called me to the foundation 12 years ago, and it's been a lot of fun to apply those talents in the church setting. And then I'm very active in Lutheran schools too, locally here in St. Louis, both at the grade school and high school level, excited to see ministry things happening. And so it's a good combination, but again, I have some background. A lot of what I'll do, like you would if you're presenting to your leaders at your schools, Google things, look them up. So some of what I have in here is start points for research, but most of it hopefully is useful and background as you frame your plans here. So I'll give you some background on our foundation. Again, that word itself can be tricky, and what we do and who we are and how we're a resource for you and for church members. Mostly we'll talk about why you started an endowment or a foundation. What are the goals of it? And then what are those things? What are the different types of endowments? The different types of foundations? There are obviously always going to be trade-offs, reasons that you might go one direction or other, or maybe neither, hopefully not that. And really, we'll talk a fair amount about spending. An endowment or a foundation isn't meant to be a saving vehicle. It's meant to fund something. Maybe it's a teacher. Maybe it's a new gym. Maybe it's an annual portion of your 5 or 10% of your budget. So we'll talk about that concept and why endowments or foundations fit into that. But starting with the LCMS Foundation, we've been around 67 years, formed at convention in the 1950s. And the LCMS is fortunate to have had decades of a buildup of an expertise pool. It's really kind of what this is for the Synod. It's a blessing to say we're self-funded, and our budget's about $11 million. And that's a slow buildup, and we'll talk about how that's structured. But what it allows is us to have resources for the church. The two things we do are help congregations and ministries to think about investing and create endowments like today's conversation. But importantly too, and maybe you know this about us, if you know somebody around kind of your district in your area, we have 20 gift planners, we call them. And they talk to our church members about their estates. And for most charities and for your schools, probably the biggest single gift you'll ever get is through an estate. And so we're excited to have this resource. We actually have, maybe some wouldn't be excited about this, but we have 4 full-time attorneys. And they're a blessing. They have expertise, and they don't actually give legal advice, but they have a specialty knowledge about the different vehicles of gifts. And really, when we talk about the importance of documents, and hopefully you're not clicking off the meeting when you hear that, but making those right documents, putting the right sort of bylaws and things in place is a big thing we can help you think about.
I will say, I think one of the great items, you do so much great work, but the deployed people who will come in and do a night about planned giving.
Right.
And right now, don't take this the wrong way, but there's a lot of wealth in people who are near enjoying eternal life. And they want those dollars to be put to work or for ministry.
Yes.
And, the ability to ask one of your people to come in and have a night, have those discussions with grandparents or individuals who are saying, look, how do I leave this behind so it really does what I've been doing my whole life? And a great opportunity in that, great wisdom. the willingness to do this, they're doing it for, hey, invite me in and that's it.
Yep.
So
Yeah, for
take
free.
advantage of
Yep.
that, right?
Very, very true, Alan. Also, a lot like how we said, this will take 6 to 12 months to get this in place. Gift planning does too. That conversation about estate, so many people don't get around to. So we can be that sort of encouragement and expertise and create a framework of how to do both things. So Al's right, that's another thing. And honestly, in the third session in May, that's part of the focus, is as you look to grow your endowment, that's a logical way to do it. Who we are, how we work, is we help to manage investments for the church and for donors. And so we actually have $1.4 billion in assets right now. These represent future money for ministries. The green part, 2/3, are conversations kind of like today. When we say investments, about 630 ministries use the LCMS Foundation to manage their endowment. Those are funds the ministry could withdraw completely, and it's very flexible, but we'll talk about that a lot today. The other part of the pie chart are donor-funded accounts, including, confusingly, endowments. So the dark blue, we'll talk about the difference between the green and the blue today. They can both be endowments in a lot of ways, but we'll talk about that. Trusts are a nice vehicle, and so the different ways we serve, but in the end, what results here is funding for ministry, and we'll show you that here. And this is something we're excited to share in our mission to serve the future financial strength of the church. Here are distributions from the LCMS Foundation by fiscal year. It's certainly a trend, and certainly last year was remarkable. And what you have there being $62 million, over 1,000 of our 7,000 LCMS entities received a gift last year. And that's the generosity of the donors. It's the encouragement of the Holy Spirit. And most of those are from conversations 25 years ago. In 2024, someone passed away, but maybe they made their gift plan in 1995. And so our work now is talking to donors will impact ministries in the 2030s and 2040s and 2050s. But again, that's how we measure our work too, is we try to think about how we're serving, and we're grateful, when financial markets are good, these last 10 and even, 50 years, it's a good time to build endowments, and a good time, as Al said, to think about people who are blessed, who maybe are giving to our school or our congregations, but they won't be able to give at some point. And so could they create an endowment potentially just to help the church and the school? So what's the goal of an endowment or foundation? You probably know this. And if this is not what you're after, today is not much use, but really, as Al said, thinking about how we're going to fund future ministry, finding a way. The idea here is sustainable support, meaning it's there every year, and that can go on for a long time. Not a guarantee it will, as we'll talk about. It also can be a source of funds for large expenses that come up. We always joke with congregations and churches, there's kind of a hierarchy. If it's only, the carpet or the parking lot, that's one number. If it's the roof or the kitchen, it's a bigger number. And the worst ones are always the elevator and HVAC, right? So, it's for those big things that come along, an endowment can be in place for that. This all is built on investment returns. In the 1970s, endowments weren't so great, and that's a reality, but we're hoping and expecting over the long term, the stock market does well, and we'll invest in the stock market effectively. And a big part of the story, as Alice kind of said, is a reason we do endowments is to give those donors confidence in making larger gifts. How will the school manage those funds? If you have a policy in place and they know who leadership is and they see how spending is happening, they're more inclined to make those larger gifts. So an endowment is really just a set of rules. It's really a fund, we would call it, and it can be created by either the donor, like the ones we saw in the pie chart that are a donor funded, a donor created, or the charity itself could create one. And that's what we'll talk about today, is that charity, when the charity starts it. As I mentioned, those funds are invested in some long-term way typically, and spending tends to be not somewhere around 5% or less is typical. And so it's meant to be sustainable long-term. But the way to create an endowment is by an action of your governing body. It could be as simple as your school board. It may involve, if your school's connected to a congregation directly, your voters, but that's really all you need to do. And it's really, as you'll see today, we'll cover endowments first and foundations second for three reasons. Number one, it's the industry practice. Anytime you see this talked about, it's always endowments and foundations. Number two, it's alphabetical. Maybe that's not why, but E&F. But the real reason is endowments are simpler. They really are easier to get to. They're lower cost. And so there's advantages to both, and we'll talk about that. But we'll talk about endowments first. So as I mentioned, some cases Many endowments are created by the charity itself, and we'll talk in that in detail. The others, and quite a few, are created by the donor. So I think it's simple to break it out that way and go through each one. So if the charity creates an endowment, it's really just a document you develop, and it would often be called bylaws, but it's not unlike, don't be too daunted, like making your HR policy, you probably already have, or a facilities policy, deciding on how you're going to manage an asset and a resource God has given you, whether it's your people, your building, or in this case, maybe some investments. But you want to define, and we'll talk more in session 2 about these details. As Al said, there's a lot of details here and specific Word documents that honestly we email pretty often to congregations when we have the same talk with them. But you want to define the purpose of the funds, oversight, who on your school board or in your community is going to have responsibility for these decisions. Of course, spending and reporting back, and we'll look at that more next time.
But that's the nice thing too, is you don't have to start from scratch.
Right.
So you've got the LCMS Foundation here that has samples and policies and so on. So there's no need to be daunted and say, oh no, how are we ever going to do this?
That's the hard part, getting started.
Exactly.
And what we do find a lot, Al, with congregations is we have a talk, I had one yesterday, and what'll happen is, well, we did this in 1998. And they'll say, can we send you our document made in WordPerfect, or something? And so, that's a start, exactly, on a floppy disk. It's a start, and sometimes that's so outdated, we can look at that with you. And again, to change it are these same steps. You would need to go to your governance committee and say, hey, we did this 20 years ago. We want to update it. Maybe it's already pretty good, but build from that. But the other big thing we'll talk about, and what's really a strategy a lot of charities use, and certainly for a school, this makes sense, is to have multiple funds within your endowment. Easy to do, common to do. It matches up to whatever those goals are for the school or for the church. These are the examples I list, but you know what those areas are. It's almost always tuition assistance in some way. And what really helps is that it lets each donor, if they have a passion for science or for music, support the specific thing that they would like to do. We'll talk about how to do that kind of more so in session 2.
I think that's interesting though, because, you're looking at an endowment and you can break it down to those different sources, but yet the money's joined together so it can grow significantly. It's just restricted to each of those areas, or it could be unrestricted portion too.
Exactly.
But also when I'm going out to meet with the donor, I can have that menu and talk with the donor about, hey, here are the different funds. This is where it is. Here's our historical growth. Here's our expectations. This is what the future looks like.
Exactly.
So it gives me that portfolio to say, let's match your desires with what we have available.
It does, Alan. That's a good point. 2 things I'll say along with that. Number 1, often you name a fund.
Mhm.
Name it after the principal, name it after the coach, name it after a part of ministry. It's called the legacy fund.
Mhm.
And sometimes when the gift is big enough, you make a new fund. When you get a donor who says, I really care about something, and they specifically will start an endowment, it's really kind of leads to the next item here, which is a donor created fund. These are different from today. These are cases where a donor makes an endowment, but they give the funds to a third party rather than the charity. There's a lot of reasons for it, but that party's called a trustee. And the same process happens. The trustee invests those funds. They control distributions. And it's important to note throughout any kind of a donor work you have, and hopefully if you have some donor conversations, hopefully in your past a little bit, that second last bullet, you've got to be careful to honor the donor's direction all the time.
Mhm.
Now, we'll talk a little bit here in week 2 about gift acceptance policy. Sometimes you want to maybe tell a donor that gift doesn't make sense. If a donor restricts a gift so much for something way outside, for instance, if their interests are contrary to the school's mission and beliefs, you certainly would be cautious and probably wouldn't accept that. And there's a joke in the industry to do with fundraising that would say certain kind of gifts, if someone were to try to give you a timeshare as a gift, there's a joke called the gift that keeps on taking. You ever heard that?
I have, yes, that is one.
So, but again, just be cautious, but these are something to know about and be aware of when you think about endowments that could affect you, but you probably wouldn't really affect it.
Well, those are sometimes, you talk about the third party ones set up, and there's typically, hey, you have to distribute this much. Sometimes those are things that we can, you write the foundation or the endowment trustee, and you might be able to get some money from
Exactly.
them because they have to distribute that. So that's another way to think about this.
Exactly. And chances are, you know who your endowment distributions are. They're annual distributions. You might even know those families and those donors. And chances are they built an endowment supporting multiple charities. And that's why they did it that way. And so they could have an annual distribution of 5%, 1% each to 5 charities, for instance. And Al's right. You should know about these and really build on those from a fundraising standpoint. And it can sit alongside the endowment we'll talk about today, but it can still be a steady source of annual funding. We've got almost 1,000 in place. I mentioned back on our total work that about 250 million of our 1.5 billion in assets are long-term endowments to benefit LCMS ministries. And typically they're 3. Often it's home church, K-8 or high school, a Concordia, and an RSO or a mission.
It's about relationships though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is
Exactly.
why you build relationships, obviously, because you're in the ministry to do so. But out of those relationships, you have people that see the work that your ministry is doing. And in terms of schools, they see that we are turning out the next generation of Christian leaders. They see the seeds being planted. They recognize that 28% of our school population is unchurched, no faith background, and the opportunity that brings. So it's relationships, telling the story. It's also listening to the people. You know, I think oftentimes we want to go in and do the ask for the listen.
Right.
So remember to listen.
Definitely. And I think good points. And I think because our schools generally are in such a strong spot right now for a lot of reasons for Al has covered with you in this webinar over time, this is a good time to talk about these things. The future looks bright, obviously, and this is a place, as Al said, for outreach. So it could resonate. But you get that sense of what those donor created funds are. And honestly, of our 62 million last year, almost 10 million is that annual spend. So that's a sustainable piece. Others tend to be a one-off bequest. But it's a component that should be consistent for each ministry receiving that payment. So the benefits of when we talk about today, an endowment you would create, it checks the boxes we talked about at the beginning, that you can have long-term funding for your charity. You can control what's happening. You can establish policy and change the policy. You can make multiple funds or endowments or purposes very easily. And it gives those donors that confidence. Now, thinking about this topic, as you think about your school, we'd encourage you to, I won't say think big, but understand entities.
Oh, I think you can think big too, right? You know, why not think big?
It's in billions.
That's right.
But it's something to put in perspective as you think about your goals. All of us, including the foundation, LCMS Foundation, struggle to think about how can we grow our budget, add more teachers, upgrade facilities, and a component to that for charities can be this endowment building. You see here a ranking of the largest university endowments across the country. It doesn't surprise you who's on it. You all know this, and it's remarkable numbers. And what we would tell you is, a couple of things. One, universities will target what % of their budget will be supported by endowment spending. Could be 5%, it could be 10%. So if their budget is $10 million, which is much larger, they'd say $1 million of that we'll take from our endowment as an annual spend. That's often the goal. What you hear about Harvard with their endowment is 1/3 of their budget is funded from their endowment spend. It's sustainable. Now they've been around since 1626,
That helps, right?
Yeah. And when we think about your ministries, what we would tell you is what they've done is they put effort into this area for decades. Harvard didn't start an endowment in 2022. They probably started their endowment, I believe it's been 300 years-ish. But that's part of the point, is that these organizations, of course, they have a larger staff. But for you as leaders, whether it's volunteers in a committee, whether it's a staff person taking that leadership to build over time is a step to take. And again, maybe you won't get to 50 billion, but you may get somewhere that really helps your school to have some funding.
Well, you don't always have to take all this on your own either. And this is where I always say, we have school boards and, well, you don't always have to just have the board. You can create a subcommittee of the board.
Exactly.
And this subcommittee could be focused on, let's start endowment, or later as we talk about foundation. You bring the right people in. There's people that they would love to be on a committee like that.
For sure. Get the ones who love spreadsheets out, is what I would say.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's a way to engage your community. Your schools, by definition, have community. Maybe you have some who aren't even that active, that this would help them to bring their talents and lead a meeting. And as Al said, maybe as part of this, you do form an endowment committee that reports to the school board. And that's really Gotta add to my slides. I've got some good things here. So switching from an endowment to a foundation, very parallel, you know, in terms of a lot of these things. But the key word on this page, on this slide, you think about the two, is a legal entity. If you make a foundation, it can be formed as a corporation or as a trust. The functions are the same. You still are going to have funds owned by that foundation. You're still going to invest in something that's going to appreciate. It doesn't have to be stocks and bonds. It could be other things like equity. It could be real estate. It could be anything that might appreciate. The foundation would control the terms to do with spending, purpose, oversight, a lot of those same things. It's also not too hard to change, but you would typically have a board for the foundation officially. You'd have officers like a treasurer. You would have sometimes employees. And those things, as you know, require expense.
Overhead.
You know, now it can pay off and it can be that it's worth it. And certainly some congregations we know of do have foundations. Certainly a lot of the Concordias have foundations. And it can make sense, and we'll talk about that, but it would require things like filing your bylaws with the Secretary of State. There'd be tax filings. Good question from Scott Sorensen, I see. We'll talk about that some, Scott. I think it depends on your appetite for simplicity or complexity. And we'll talk more about the advantages and disadvantages, and we'll work to those answers to that good question.
I will say, you know, this is an area, a lot of our, I won't say most, but a significant number of our Lutheran schools have endowments because it's run out of the school itself. You know, if you have a head of school, principal, you know, your board, you're working on endowments. Foundations, well, we have more of our Lutheran schools looking at, let's start a foundation, and the foundation then is dedicated to raising those funds, and then the distribution of it that Mark was talking about a little bit before, all of that's coming out of the foundation. It might go to a couple Lutheran schools because maybe the foundation oversees an association kind of setup. So maybe 4 elementary schools and a high school or something. So a little bit different philosophy, but similar ideas of how you support, sustain, and grow Lutheran school ministries.
Agreed. Good point, Al. I think when you have an association situation, as Ralph said, where you might have, as you know, if you have an association, there's complexities there to deal with about governance. And so maybe multiple endowments make sense. You know, it could be a combination. Often a foundation would create endowments and sit inside the foundation. So an endowment's a simpler way. And so we'll keep talking and keep, hopefully by the end of May, we'll have a consensus, or again, you'll decide what's best for your school is more to the point.
Yeah.
But as you think about foundations, here's some background, because you hear about this a lot on the primary structures of foundations. And we'll go through each one. Obviously today, we're looking at number 2. Creating a legal entity potentially for your school is what you might consider doing. The other 2, both could benefit your school and our ministries, but they're not what you do, but they're large, especially the grant making. And so the grant making foundation is probably the best known. Often it's funded, they often are large. They're funded often by a wealthy family, generations into building wealth. Corporations will start them, and some nice ones happen here in St. Louis that are part of the community. Wonderful things that the corporation recognizes to give back and support specific causes within their communities. Government entities, especially hospitals and health related, have foundations, even education related, those exist. Some of the ones you know nationally, we'll see some data. Those large ones, Gates Foundation, Lilly Foundation. Within our community, maybe you probably do know, Lutheran and the Fort Wayne Foundations both. Those are generous annual distributions to many ministries, and they're funded by hospitals closing, as maybe some of you know, in both those communities in our, 30, 40 years ago. And I'm sure you know the Herzog Foundation for Educators. That's such a great resource for us to take advantage of as schools to educate and to help our educators. Again, here, the grant process is hard work. I'm always amazed when I learned in my career somewhere in my 20s that some people's full-time job is to give away these funds.
Amazing, doesn't it? Yeah.
But that's what that is. There's a formalized application. And so you're aware of that.
I think it's important too. And, looking at like the Gates or the Lutheran Foundation, St. Louis or Indiana, or Herzog, all of them have different philosophies.
Right.
And so when you go to these organizations, be aware of who they are. And it also helps you analyze, how do I create our foundation
Exactly.
by examining how they have done it. Like Herzog, you can go to Herzog and you can ask for a grant for a building or something.
Yeah, specific areas.
You're not really going to get it because all of their funds are into training.
Yeah.
So, they'll deny this, but then they'll, hey, come in and we pay for 3 days of training and all you have to do is cover the cost of getting here. So different philosophies.
You're exactly right, Alan. What you need to do as a school is decide what are you going to prioritize and document for future decades and beyond to say, what are those specific things we'll spend funds on? So you might not have a formalized grant process, but there will be a decisioning process of what things within your school to fund and who's going to make that choice. And so there's some similar points. I was right. You can learn from others out there. Maybe look at their bylaws, look at their website, even that will define those things. In this arena of grant making foundations, they would have a similar percentage distribution, as we'll talk about a lot for endowments. But that grant process makes them have to say no, as you probably realize, and of course there's full-time grant writers out there, as we talked about, but that's one field of this arena.
And even, so I'll go back to my days as a head of a school, and, our desire was we looked at the future of our endowment growth, and every year we kind of hoped grow 8%.
Sure.
And that was fantastic.
Yeah.
If it grows 8%, you're in a land of honey right there. But you'd look then at utilizing 5% of that as distribution because you wanted the other 3% because you're always looking at building because those dollars like to multiply when they see other dollars.
Yes.
So you have to analyze that. And then, maybe there's a year where you say, okay, well, we're a little bit thin this year. We need to go 8%, but that's that decision making that I think you're so wise. That's a great way to put it. It's that how do you do that so that you don't wreck the future as well?
Definitely. And what we'll share today, honestly, in these few months, and what we talk to ministries about is just mainstream investment, endowment, and foundation thinking. As Al said, spend a little less than what the asset appreciation is really for inflation as much as anything. If you want to have sustainable funding and give your teachers raises, you can't spend 8% every year if it's up 8%, obviously. And so that's the thinking. And it isn't always up 8% too, right? There's complicated, the real world.
It was nice when it was.
The real world gets in the way of our theories. But again, something to shoot for here. When we say think big, these foundations, now most of these are funded differently from how we would fund our endowments. But interestingly, right, in this scale, they're about the same size as the biggest. Isn't it weird? The largest ones, like Bill and Melinda Gates there, I think they're no longer together, by the way. It's probably just the Gates Foundation now, this is a few years old. But 60 billion, close to Harvard's, right? So, so interesting that the size and scale, but boy, the differences they can make. And as Al said, each one of those has a careful conversation of why are these funds here and what are we going to support? And they may have annual ones they always support and new ones. And so there's a whole conversation about what they're trying to do. And you already know what your school wants to do, right? So we have an advantage. We have a clarity. Interesting, guys. Number 23 amazes me. Remember that woman back at the older ones among us? Remember Leona Helmsley, who was so controversial? Her family made a charitable trust. So she was always a controversial landlord. And I'm like, wow. But nevertheless, some perspective for us as we think on our school side. Back to what you could do is create a legal entity supporting your school. Again, it's often structured as a trust or a nonprofit corporation, already getting complicated. It's common certainly for larger charities. Honestly, where I work is an example of this. We're a legal foundation. We support, rather than a single charity, a collection of charities on the LCMS umbrella. And so we check the boxes and we actually file a lot of this. And believe me, we have 4 attorneys, not to mention external attorneys. And there's a lot of oversight and really different level of complexity and governance to making a foundation that really, there's a lot of governance to an endowment, but it's pretty much in-house. It's a donor conversation, and it's within your own governance. The third one to think about, you'll hear about, is a family foundation. This is not typically legally a foundation. It could be, but it's often a newer, fast-growing giving vehicle you should know about. It's really a special form of a donor-advised fund, which it's a really fast-growing part of the charitable world. And the nice part of a donor-advised fund It lets the donor have a big tax break when they fund this account. And they're only required to distribute 5% a year. So it's more of a reference point as you hear about foundations that's out there. And that's something else. If you did talk to a foundation gift planner or another, fundraising conversation, these are another place for you to seek funding, but it really doesn't fit under the umbrella of what you could establish. So the benefits of foundations are a lot like the slide that we saw for endowments. Long-term funding for your charity. You can control policy. You can make multiple funds within your foundation, and it gives donors confidence, which is a big part of the conversation. Here are those differences from an endowment. Sometimes the benefits can be the effort and the visibility of a foundation can make it grow faster, can give it credibility. It can encourage volunteers. When someone can be part of a board, it expands your formal community within your school. And you'll see it with a capital F, and it'll maybe get some awareness, and certainly there's value to that. And we see that from congregations even, that they've created a foundation and it's worked. They've gotten further. Now, we've seen a lot of ministries develop endowments that have worked. So the same awareness and same benefits can happen with an endowment when it's handled the right way. It's the same supporting people, whether it's either entity.
Do what works for you and for your community.
Yeah.
Because I think that's almost that needs
Exactly.
assessment idea too, of saying, hey, if we do a foundation, are we trying to do something that our people really don't understand and might be a little concerned about? Or, hey, we should do a foundation because people understand it more and they recognize a foundation more than if we just talk to them about it.
Exactly.
Needs assessment, right?
Totally. And like Al said all along, those people in your community who could be at this committee, their background's going to help. If you have somebody in your school that's an attorney that knows about foundations, that's a huge advantage.
Financial planners, an attorney, an accountant, the spreadsheet guru.
Exactly.
And they can all just get together and hammer things out and have discussions. Just sit back and watch. It's amazing the direction they can get you started and headed and oversee.
Right.
Use talent, right?
Yeah. And their experience that they bring as volunteers even. The drawbacks that we see are two, and there's something to consider. In particular, the separate legal entity issue can be tricky. If you create a foundation and you have bylaws and you have governance and a board, if that board's not identical to your school board, and it might not be, as we talked about, over decades, you can have drift. You can have leadership thinking. You could have, maybe if you have a situation where you have a foundation and there's multiple churches or schools, one of the churches closes, and there's different thinking about how that affects the foundation. So there's just things to think about there to consider. In addition, that cost, the oversight, the dollar cost, but also the energy cost of the foundation is simply more than it would be with an endowment. And in the end, that's going to come out of the investment income of those funds is really where that, or from the school's budget, operating budget, one of the two.
Yeah. Well, and that sometimes can be where donors get concerned too, because they'll ask you, what's your operating costs, your overhead expenses?
Exactly.
And they want to see it as low as possible because they want their money to go to the charity.
Right.
And not necessarily to the people running the foundation. And it's also, its own entity, like you're saying, and you got to be careful of mission drift and alignment. What if board members change? What if the executive director of it or the school principal and relationships going on there too? You have to really be aware. So there's definite benefits, but there's definite concerns.
And I agree, Alan. The truth of the matter is, those are more likely when the foundation gets larger. When it's a small foundation with $50,000, it's not much, but if it's $15 million down the road and there's mindsets and there's interest, there could be more energy put into these different ideas. The part I didn't put on the page, I was coached by my legal counsel at the foundation with 4 attorneys not to write this down, but you should know, and this is where you actually listen for the first time, right? Is that historically there's been a mindset within the church to say, we need to protect assets from a lawsuit.
Yeah.
If our school gets sued, we need to make a foundation so that we have assets that don't, that aren't affected. What we would tell you, you didn't hear this from me, this is unofficial, close your eyes, but is that generally doesn't work legally, that a court would say if there's a single foundation or endowment but it's a foundation especially, supporting a single ministry or a single entity, that if there's harm or damage that the school has caused, that the foundation is not a shield. But don't take legal advice from me, but that's also something you'll see as foundations were created. We've had this conversation by ministries, and sometimes it's created when they had that legal blowout. And the reaction to that was
you never know until it goes through the court system, right? But they're always looking for ways to attach and to show, what that attachment is, and therefore they can be part of that lawsuit as well. And you get so many of those settled out of court anyway through insurance companies and so on. But that's where, again, utilize the attorneys,
Exactly.
utilize,
Ask them.
make sure it's all set up correctly. It's very important that you dot your i's and cross your t's on all of these items.
Definitely. And ask professionals, just like your insurance, just like these bigger areas that you work with, to do with your city governance, your local town, if you got zoning rules to do with building, right? You've got to check with the town planning and zoning. But in an ideal world, if the benefits included for sure, that you could protect assets from a lawsuit, this would be on this slide. And we'd be encouraging you for sure to make a foundation. So I don't know that it isn't a benefit, let an attorney help you, but
yeah. And I think most of the places that have an endowment would then have a foundation, because it would be protected. You just say, oh, well, let's go down that path. So
yeah,
always be careful of those things, because it's great conversations to have. And I think ideally, you're looking at how does it benefit the ministry in the best way,
Right.
endowment or foundation, and be confident in that direction.
definitely. Consult an attorney. So when we take these,
We say that a lot.
yeah. I mean, and as you know, they'll give you an answer that can be sometimes, it depends,
Yeah, exactly.
but at least you check the box. But so here are those benefits of each. And as we talked about, really the benefits of the first 5 are there for both. A lot of the reasons you want to do an endowment or foundation are the same, and they let you get that long-term funding, have some kind of governance in place. They're invested often very similarly. Their spending is a big consideration, and the confidence for donors. It's the other pieces that are more to consider that we've already talked about. And this is to that question, what is better? Depends on your people, on your mindset, on your history, your experience, and what your peers might say in your communities. I think we covered these pretty well, but it's all kind of in one place now as you kind of absorb all this sort of thing here. A bit more on the industry and on the parts that really matter, kind of getting to spending. The funds are there to be used, and for the endowment industry for decades, really from the origins of endowments until maybe 20 years ago, it was always interest, dividends, and capital gains were spent. You pick a historic cost, you'd say, we got a gift of $1 million. We're going to spend, if interest is 5% and dividends are 2% and it's up, we're going to spend that money and get back to 100,000 all the time. That was the approach for decades. So what happened in the 2000s is a couple things. One, interest rates started to get lower. And they had historically been 5, 6, 7% a lot, or even 8% in CDs and bank accounts and even bonds. Pretty safe interest, pretty nice place. In fact, most endowments were in interest-bearing accounts maybe back then, much more were. But with equity returns in the last 40 years or so, really being a bull market, so many endowments, universities, charities switched their holdings to be more equity-based, where there is no interest, there's some dividends, but capital gains are really variable. Some years it could be up, like last year, 20 or 25%. Some years it's down 25%. And so that leads to inconsistent funding. And so the industry collectively, Al and I were talking before we went live about NIL, how it's a state by state thing. This MIFA that we'll talk about here, these things take time. And so what's happened across the country since the mid 2000s is a conversation about what's the best way to manage endowments. In addition, as we talked about already, there's so many documented gifts from donors that their language might say in their gift, you can only do interest and dividends and capital gains. What MIFA does, what this law that states have adopted, I believe, maybe Pennsylvania hasn't, I'm not a lawyer still, but for the most part of MIFA is how all the universities we saw, I imagine, are under that, meaning they're spending according to a percentage rather than interest, dividends, and historic cost basis.
And if if your school goes through an audit, you will have the question of MIFA, and it will be in that management letter as well, because they'll expect that you have this policy.
And there's more to it than just the spending, as I was saying, there's guidance, I think, on how funds are invested. I mean,
Yes.
reporting, I'm not even sure on that, but I know that led to how the industry's changed
Mhm.
to provide consistent funding for ministry with the intention, like we've already talked about, to have a sustainable long-term funding source that goes up slowly, maybe along with inflation.
Mhm.
And so this transition has changed how endowments are managed. You can certainly choose any spending you want if you make your own endowment or a foundation. But this may push you towards your goals. And so when we think about spending, here's the way to think about it. A foundation or an endowment owns assets held in investments typically, and spending is done as a percentage. And what's typical is, there's a lot of surveys done.
Mhm.
There's a lot of comparisons among peers on this. And so right now the trend is between 4 and 5% annually is spent, with the thinking that returns are 7 or 8%. And that's really the norm. Now there's a lot more to it you can do, but as a baseline, if you had an endowment worth $2 million, you could spend 80,000 a year. And would that cover a faculty person? I don't know. Would that
Yes.
get there?
Yes, it would. What I always talk with schools about though too is the fact of, think about this, because sometimes you want to start an endowment, but the house is crumbling. So that $2 million in an endowment and the 4% draw, that 80,000 is not going to put you where you need to be when over here, the house isn't in order. And
Exactly.
you can put that money to use to first, get where you need to be and then build an endowment after that. So you also have to, again, do your own needs assessment as a school. Where will this money do us the most benefit? So that will cost benefit analysis there. Because it might, if you do these things over here, you get more students coming in, which then means the tuition dollars over 4 years, and that might have a greater financial impact than the endowment. That doesn't mean take the endowment off the table,
Right.
but do good analysis to figure out where those dollars are best put to work.
Agreed. To be honest with you, Al, I think an endowment's kind of a luxury item.
Yeah.
If you have huge debt, if you have huge deferred capital expenses,
Yeah.
if you have, other needs within your staff, it's not the first place you go.
Yeah.
If a donor gives you funds that are meant to be endowed, that's when you might do this.
Then you
because they-
go,
because they-
absolutely, because they're
Yeah.
saying that. So don't turn that away unless
Right.
it goes counter to your philosophy, admission and everything. But absolutely take that and then put the $80,000 to work, because it gives you those funds that you wouldn't have otherwise. And, so we built up a decent endowment. We would tap in every year because we were using, basically write-offs for tuition assistance.
Right.
Well, now we had real dollars to cover
Offset
tuition
it.
assistance,
Exactly.
which meant
Exactly.
salaries could go up in the other
So
areas.
it's funded. So it's funded financial aid.
Fully
is what it can
funded,
be.
yeah,
Yep.
financial aid in that
Exactly.
case. So,
Exactly.
which, again, that's where you talk through these things, you analyze, a plan.
Yep. And that's why it takes 6 or 12 months, or maybe even 18, or you make a policy, you're done in 12 months, but then you change it
Mhm.
because you get a new gift or you get some different
Mhm.
perspectives, and it's going to be a living document.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you hear that term in the foundation and endowment world, corpus.
Mhm.
And that word was more important 20 years ago. It's sort of that base historic cost, but the principle, the concept of having that corpus maintain and grow is still something endowments seek. Even with the spending approach, that's the goal. And we'll show some examples here soon, but the different time horizons you'll see for endowments, it isn't just, we talked, I guess, really about number one the most, a perpetual endowment with a steady annual spend kind of in perpetuity. There's always a component of that to an endowment typically, but there can be some variations. Number one, a term of years where the donor, this is typically donor required, where they say, we don't want money to sit there for 100 years or whatever. We want the corpus to be spent too. And that can be a 5, 10, 20-year window. And they'll say, we like the 5% spend, but in addition, we'll look at an example. The other one you'll hear, and really what so many ministries would create, is the bottom one. The quasi endowment that you hear, where it's meant to be long-term, but it's also got flexibility that you could address a short-term capital surprise at any time and allow for maybe an approval that requires, let's say, voters exceeding 75%. Or some hurdle that's fairly high to spend part of that corpus. And so again, this terminology is a little fungible, but in the end, you'll write a document defining how the funds can be spent and when. And that's really the key that you'll want to address is, what controls do we have in place
Uh-huh.
to communicate expected spending as your team plans for annual budgets, but to allow for those emergency uses too. So finally, we get to the spreadsheets, and so this is that example. And if you're the one who likes this page, you need to be on the committee. You can lead those meetings. But here's an example of an endowment, of $1 million endowment. And again, as Al said, that investment return column, that'd be great. If we had 10 years straight of 7%, you will never see that, of course, but that's the whole, and if you average that over a longer term, that's really how this is all built. And so what you see is every year your balance goes up because of that. You're investing in stocks and bonds and the market's going up, and that's the good part. You get your statement. You're spending 4% is how we did this example. And you see that first year it's a $40,000 spend. And so on the net, it went up 70, down 40, and it grew by 30,000. Over that 10-year window, this could fund an increasing part of your budget, from 40,000 up to 52,000 by 10 years out. And again, the thinking is whatever you're spending in your budget needs to grow to keep up with raises or cost of living or the utilities and all the different expenses you have. But a basic endowment or a foundation, would have an endowment with this same structure, to be honest. It's really the same math. But you might have a column for expense there, right? You have a bigger column. You might lose a percentage because you're spending money on attorneys. That's something to think about, is maybe it wouldn't grow as much.
Which you should have a forecast spreadsheet like this. I mean, that's one of the key elements when you have this. You don't just fly by year, you do your forecast spreadsheet.
Definitely, Alan. What you do is have this in your budget. The LCMS Foundation, we've got some endowed funds.
Yeah.
And so about 2% of our budget is supported by our spend from our endowment to try to live out in our ministry the same way and fund our work partially with endowment. So gifts that have been made to our foundation. The second example is the term of years, meaning the donor has said, this is typically donor directed to spend the corpus. And so here's an example. And at the bottom is what's most common. They make $1 million gift and they say, in addition to annual spend, also spend 100,000 a year. Because I like spreadsheets, I did a fully amortizing 10-year that gets us down to $6. I couldn't get it to zero. I was tweaking. But if you spent 117, you see that number there of your corpus, because it's growing in value, that number is higher than 100,000. This is part of the benefit of having an endowment. You have more to spend because of the 7% return. Now, there's no guarantee we're going to get that 7% return. Keep that in mind. But this is that long-term build that all these universities and these charitable grant-making foundations are built on. You still have the 4%. But notice the 4% goes down over time in this model because the balance is going down. So the math all works, but this is not a long-term, it's a medium-term source of funding.
Yeah.
And maybe it's meant for, CapEx, for projects that have a finite nature.
Yeah, well, and it's really front loaded. So, as you're going to the future, those capital projects won't be there as much. So you got to figure that out.
What we would say to that, Al, to think about, you made me think of this just now, is you can invest some of those extra dollars in future fundraising.
Yes.
And investing in building your endowment with staff. As we talked about, these universities with large endowments have employees in the hundreds talking to donors. They have systems. They have strategies. And so could you find a way to make a part-time job of one of your staff people now to think about building the endowment?
That's a good idea.
The final spreadsheet would be the model I think most might use that we see in ministries, and the documents would share with you, would show you how to set this up, meaning same $1 million gift, same 7% return, same 4% spend, but this allows for an occasional large expense as needed. Again, I picked a couple. I always think of we just did the HVAC in this building. I'm on the building committee at the IC. We just did the elevators first time in 40 years. And HVAC we're doing too. So
that's the one that always comes up, the lifespan of HVAC.
Exactly. And for all of us as long-term thinkers, endowments fit into this, right? So this would show how that balance would trend. But you see the spending goes down, of course, because the ending balance goes down each year for the years where you had those big expenses. What we'll say though is you can grow it, right? You should add gifts to it. You should think about how to have this fund grow. And it's really not going to grow from the market growth, as we've seen. That's really going to be what you spend. It's new gifts. They're going to make this fund grow. So we're kind of right on time for our takeaways here that they really have the same purpose, those two vehicles. They're different ways to get to the same goal. A foundation to help you think about it would probably create endowments. So endowments you probably have either way. It's that legal entity you could consider. This is all built on the stock market. And as we know, it can go up and down. It's been a good market. Gosh, most of the last 45 years, to be honest.
Yes.
You know, there's been a lot of downs.
Everybody keeps waiting for it to correct.
Right. We're long-term investors at LCMS Foundation, and so many of our peers are too. This is how every investor really looks at the pension plan that we're all part of. And Concordia Plans is built on this, but they grow through new gifts. And another cliche in the industry, we've said a couple already, you know, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, right? Second best time is now. And so do you wish you started this foundation in 1995? Sure. But here you are. And again, these steps you take will really make that difference. And so
Don't wait another 20 years, right?
exactly,
You know?
get started. It may take you 6, 12, 18
20,
months.
20 years from now, those dollars can have grown significantly.
Yes, we have some case studies we could share. You know, that's how these things happen is leaders took steps at some point in the church or the charity history. Where a lot of this information comes from is we have conversations. My colleague, Phil Krupski, leads our gift planning team, has a lot of expertise, honestly, in different structures here. And so these are resources to help you get into this issue and see what academics are saying and the industry is saying.
Yeah, and I can't say enough, you know, if you are interested, contact the LCMS Foundation because as Mark is saying, obviously, Mark is incredibly well versed and works in this all the time and doing the presentation. But everyone at the LCMS Foundation, there's so many areas, so much knowledge, and wanting to share that with everybody as well, because that's the ministry mindset of working with the LCMS Foundation. And they are more than happy to talk at any point in time.
And like you said, it's just complicated.
Mhm.
And getting started, both for donors, for a couple, a husband and wife, for a church member who knows that, you know, I need to work on this. We can help. And on the endowment side, same way. And so here's what we'll cover next time. Hopefully it's useful and great questions already. Which one's better? Up to you to think about. But we'll talk next time more about the nuts and bolts. What do you actually do? What do documents look like? If you're excited for that session, I know I am, but that's really the place to get, and we can help you work through those specific things you want to fund, the ways you want to make decisions. You need to think about how you're going to report to your community, and even the investment side too. So we'll dig into that next time, and hopefully you're able to join us again then. But thanks for the time today.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Great presentation. And, you know, I'll say this again, it's not, you don't have to know everything. You just have to know the people that know these things.
Agreed.
And that's why I went to Mark and I said, hey, can you do this? And he so readily said, absolutely.
Yeah.
This would be great. And again, utilize the LCMS Foundation and others that know this, utilize the people in your community that you can bring in to serve on a committee that are just chomping at the bit to do something like that.
Yep.
So that's the leadership, is bringing the people in who have wisdom in all these different areas.
Right. Get started, get the experts involved.
Will, do we have any questions here that we can take quickly, or?
I do not see any questions.
We're good. All right. Well, I'm sure they're all thinking about it, especially the spreadsheets, and I love those too. And there's just so much that you can do with this. Like I said, we used a portion of ours to fully fund, you know, tuition assistance and some of the other things. Teacher salaries, we know the pay is low. That's one of the feedbacks that we get all the time from when Will puts out the Lutheran teacher retention surveys, and just other items with that. And it could be busing, you know, to bring students in from other places where transportation is an issue for them, and HVAC, all these projects. You know, think about how to utilize those funds to do so much for your ministry. Not just for sustainability, but growth and outreach and all the amazing things that you can do with that. So thank you again, Mark. Let me close this in prayer, and then we'll close out here. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this wonderful and glorious day, for Mark's presentation, all the information about endowments and foundations, and we look forward to the next presentations as well. We ask you help us be good stewards of all that you have given to us. Be bold in our outreach, asking people to give so that we can reach more individuals and care for our staff, our students, our community at large, as well as we constantly focus on sharing your precious gospel message. Help us to make the most of this day and most of our ministry